This is a store, revolution. We take the revolution and the books part very seriously. We're talking about a real revolution, that it's not possible to make any real progress in human emancipation without the overthrow of this system, capitalism, imperialism. And it's possible to build a whole new and much better world based on the new communism developed by Avakian, which is at the center of our store. And I really encourage everyone to dig into Avakian and what he's developed and the pathway he's charting and continues to chart. And this is a time when revolution is in the air in a way that it hasn't been for decades in this country. And it's very important that people confront. We're in the cusp of a situation which could either open up possibilities for emancipating revolution or could go to a horrific fascism. And in that context, Bruce's book is very important. It's very important that people read it and understand what it's saying. And I want to, part of introducing people to our story, I want to reference that on our wall we have the 3 things that have to happen in order for there to be real and lasting change for the better. And this is from Avakian, and he's first, people have to fully confront the actual history of this country. And in this case, we're talking about not just this country, and its role in the world up to today and the terrible consequences of this. 2, people have to dig seriously and scientifically into how this system of capitalism, imperialism actually works and what this actually causes in the world. And 3, people have to look deeply into the solution of all of this. So those 3 points really sort of frame the mission of our store in a certain sense, and also a really important guidepost for what's going on for dealing with what's going on in the world right now. And I won't go further into revolution, but I encourage people to talk to people who are on our staff and get into what we have to say. We have many books and many pamphlets which are very rich and extremely important right now. And I especially wanted to highlight 2 of these books. One is this Constitution for a New Socialist Republic in North America, which is a visionary, emancipating constitution for a whole new society, different from any constitution ever conceived or applied anywhere in the world. And yes. And also this pamphlet, which is Real Revolution in This Time, What the Powers That Be Don't Want You to Know. And this is a encapsulation of crucial social media posts that Avakian has done, which give a basic picture of what this revolution is and why it's possible and what we've got to do to bring it about. So with that, I just want to say a few things about Bruce's book. I really, really encourage everyone to read the book. To me, it was very heavy to read the book. I've actually read a lot about fascism over many years, but what you get in Bruce's book is a vivid story of Bruce's extended family and their friends, and the intimate changes they go through in the course of enormous world events that transform German society and end up, as people know, in the Holocaust. You see people you've come to understand and really feel for become increasingly hounded, branded, harassed, restricted, and then finally murdered. And I'm sitting there reading this book at the very same time that Holocaust is being used as the excuse for a genocide in Palestine, which is going on literally. I mean, I was thinking about the conditions that Jews faced in Germany in the camps and the conditions of the Palestinians right now. So Bruce raises the point in his book that our answer to what the Jews went through under the Nazis has to be never again for anyone. And that's really, really important sort of moral and political guidepost right now. And we really have to work for a world where that can become a reality. And that's urgent and extremely important. So with that, I will stop and hand the stage over to Bruce.
Thank you, Barry, for those words, and thank you, everybody, for being here. I hope that this book does help people understand this history. It's a history that obviously, and in many ways, is still with us and is being used and misused, as Barry kind of referred to, in justifying the oppression of other people. With that, I'm just going to get into this. I'm going to try to speak, not too long, maybe half an hour, 35 minutes, something like that. And then we're going to get into Q&A with Barry and then open it up for everyone. So here we go. Postcards to Hitler is the story of acts of resistance to Nazism, but also in the context in which it took place. Over the years and in researching this book, I came to conclusions about the historical circumstances in Germany and Europe that led to Nazism's ascension to power, that gave rise to racialization of anti-Semitism, and to conditions that led to genocide in what we call the Holocaust. All of these and other issues inform my writing of this book. But I wanted first and foremost to tell the story of a family, 4 interrelated families, in fact, that lived this history. So let me start with how I began, how this whole process of writing about my grandfather began. And I'll read from the prologue here. While I was on a visit to my parents' house in Long Beach, California in the early 1980s, my father handed me a thick folder of letters he and his sister had received from their parents, Benno and Anna Neuburger, between 1938 and 1941. This much I knew at the time. During those years, my grandparents, Benno and Anna, tried to leave Germany to join their children, who had immigrated to the United States. They were unsuccessful. Both died in 1942, a day or two apart, in very different places. My father had told me that his mother was murdered in a camp somewhere east of Germany, and his father was executed in Berlin after having been convicted in the Nazi so-called People's Court for having written a letter of outrage to Hitler. So this began with a puzzling question. I had this thick folder of letters that I eventually got translated. That's my grandparents. Thick letters that I eventually got translated. But it wasn't until the early 1990s, after my father had passed away, that the puzzling story of a letter to Hitler got resolved. When the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, documents from the Nazi People's Court, which had luckily remained intact, revealed a trove of information which included the fact that Benno was put on trial for treason in July 1942, not for writing a letter to Hitler, but for having placed a series of postcards anonymously in the mail from September 1941 to late February 1942, denouncing Hitler and warning of an unfolding genocide. In the early 1990s, my Aunt Honey, my father's sister, handed me this document, which was the summary of Benno's trial in the so-called People's Court. This document was discovered by German researchers and historians looking for evidence of German Jewish resistance. Wolf Gruner, who heads the Department of Genocide Research at the University of Southern California, was one of those historians. And he wrote and published stories of Benno's resistance. All this was quite important for me in writing this book. And centrally, this set me on a path to understand more deeply how Nazism and the persecution of Jews unfolded over time. I just want to say also, I owe a great debt of gratitude to so many German historians who have devoted themselves to keeping alive the history and keeping it in front of the German people. And there's the whole number of them that I've become friends with, and their work was crucial to being able to write this history. In the years since, the story of Benno's resistance has reached a wider audience. Benno's story was a notable part of an anti-fascist event in Munich this past April, which I was at. And here's a clip of a mass meeting at the Volks Theater in Munich and the lead up to an April 11 march and rally of thousands of people, which was called the Return of the Names. It was organized by the Bavarian Broadcast Network. So I'm going to show this clip here, and here we go.
München, Mitte der 20er Jahre. Nach dem brutalen und leidvollen Ersten Weltkrieg herrscht Aufbruchsstimmung. Für die meisten Münchner eine Zeit voller Hoffnung auf ein Leben in Frieden. Auch für Benno Neuburger. Nach den Schicksalsschlägen der letzten Jahre hofft der Kaufmann auf einen Neuanfang. Er lebt zusammen mit seiner Frau und 2 Kindern mitten in München. Die jüdische Familie leidet unter den verschlechterten Lebensbedingungen seit der Machtübernahme Hitlers. Die Bedrohungen durch das aufkommende NS-Regime werden spürbar. Tochter Johanna und Sohn Fritz wandern in die USA aus, kurz vor der sogenannten Reichskristallnacht. In dieser Nacht wird auch Benno Neuburger in das KZ Dachau verschleppt. Die Nationalsozialisten zwingen den Grundstücksmakler zur Aufgabe seiner Firma. Nur so kommt er kurz darauf wieder frei. Neuburger durchschaut den grausamen Plan der Nazis und beschließt zu handeln. Er bringt seinen Hass auf Hitler zu Papier und schreibt anonyme Postkarten. Um auf die aussichtslose Situation hinzuweisen, verteilt er die Warnungen in seiner Nachbarschaft. Doch die Gestapo kommt ihm auf die Schliche und verhaftet ihn. Wegen Vorbereitung zum Hochverrat verurteilte der Volksgerichtshof Benno Neuburger zum Tode. Er wurde am 18. September 1942 hingerichtet. München heute. Frieden seit fast 8 Jahrzehnten. Doch der Druck auf unsere Demokratie ist ständig spürbar. Damit wir Extremismus und Intoleranz bereits im Keim ersticken können, müssen wir die Mahnung der Geschichte ernst nehmen. Auf einzigartige Weise gedenken wir deshalb den Münchner Frauen, Männern und Kindern, die im Zweiten Weltkrieg verfolgt und ihrer Menschlichkeit beraubt wurden. Am 11. April werden 1000 Paten mit Plakaten im gesamten Stadtgebiet an die Opfer erinnern. Die Aktion Rückkehr der Namen bringt die Menschen und ihre Schicksale als lebendiges Mahnmal zurück in die Mitte unserer Gesellschaft. Mit einem Gedenkzug vom Königsplatz zum Odeonsplatz setzen wir ein Zeichen gegen das Vergessen und für gesellschaftliche Vielfalt.
Oops, okay. Okay, so that was shown prior to April 11. April 11 was a large gathering of people in Munich to remember the the names of those murdered by the Nazis, not just Jewish people, but communists, socialists, and Roma people, gay and lesbian folks, and so on. So as part of an overtly anti-fascist movement in Germany. I mean, it's complicated, and maybe we can get into this a little bit later in the Q&A. I learned a lot when I was on that trip. There are contradictions, in terms of what the German people are sort of like rallying around in terms of opposing the rise of the right, and then there's there's the German government, and it's absolute support of what's going on, what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. So anyway, there's a lot of contradictions there, but there is a strong anti-fascist movement in Germany, which I think is important to learn from. So I want to step back here and get into some of what I regard as some of the key political issues and historical events that underlies this story and the era that this book deals with. Benno Neuburger, my grandfather, was born in Munich in 1871. A coincidence of years, because 1871 was the year of the German victory in a war with France, which was the catalyst for the unification of the 23 separate German states into a unified state, which became known as the Second Reich. And you can see here on the left right-hand side of your screen, left-hand side, the separate German states, and the conclusion, the unification which took place in France and at Versailles, which was a real kind of a in-your-face to the French on the part of the Germans. The war and the reparations that France had to pay Germany after the war left an antagonism between the ruling elites of these countries that would have disastrous consequences in years to come. But Germany's victory in the Franco-Prussian War and unification gave a boost to Germany's rapid industrialization. By the early 1900s, Germany surpassed England and France, which were its main rivals. It surpassed them in industrial production. Okay, that's just a little. And for many middle-class Jews who gained, at least on paper, equality in the new German constitution, this was an era of great opportunities after this unification of Germany. And I want to read just a little bit from the book that gets into that, because I think it's important to understand that the progression of things here. Let's see. Okay. German intellectual accomplishments surged in the years after unification. Jews played a significant role in this, in such arenas as literature, science, music, medicine, and psychology. Among the 15 German Nobel Prize winners in science and literature in the first decade of the new century, 4, Otto Wallach, Paul Heiss, Paul Ehrlich, and Adolf von Baer, were Jews. Many factors contributed to Jews' success, but certainly one of them was their determination to prove themselves worthy while proving their detractors wrong. So the unification of Germany and Germany's rise as an industrial power in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, saw a kind of golden age for Jews. And there was a great deal of optimism, and I write about that in the book in terms of my grandparents and what they experienced in those years. But there's something here really important to understand about this prosperity, which Jews were part of, were able to take advantage of, as they moved out of the small towns into the larger cities. And that's another part of the story that the book goes into. But the old sort of traditional religion started to break down, but also the prejudice that Jews faced living in small towns and, being marked as Jews. When they went to the cities, their situation changed because they were more anonymous. And there was a certain sense of liberation for Jews. So Jews migrated out of the small towns in that era into the larger cities in bigger numbers, percentage-wise, than the general population did, because it was more of a liberating thing for Jews at that point, to get away from the stereotypes that they were forced to live with and under. But this was an era of growing contention between European states. Okay, this era that I'm talking about here. Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, pointed out how the rise of industrial and finance capital in Europe spurred a race for colonies and the division of the world among industrializing countries. Germany was a latecomer to the race for colonies. And let me put that in there. So you can see the countries in red are actually the British Empire, the ones in yellow are the French, and the ones in gray are Germany. So Germany, emerges as one of the great industrial powers in Europe, and its population is larger, and its industrial capacity surpasses that of France and England. And it has the same kind of necessity as these capitalist, imperialist countries, these colonizing countries have, to reach out to grab resources, cheap labor, markets, and so on. But the world has already been sort of carved up prior to Germany getting to this stage. And so this was one of the things that sets the stage for the conflict to come. Germany attempted to carve out an empire in a world already colonized. And their attempts were opposed by England and France, and then Tsarist Russia as well, who formed an alliance called the Triple Entente. Okay, and you can see the purple is the alliance of those three countries. And that alliance really was brought in 1904, was brought together principally to block Germany, to oppose the rise of German power on the European continent. European colonialism, and here's another point that I think is really important. European colonialism was, and as we can see in current events, is an extraordinarily brutal affair. Europe extracted enormous wealth from the colonized people. It was estimated that by the turn of the century, European nations controlled 80% of the world's financial wealth. Justification for extreme plunder and violence to enforce it rested on racial arguments. Non-European people were held to be racially inferior, childlike, savage, prone to terrorism and crime, and on and on. This racial thinking, first directed at non-European peoples, especially Africans, Latin Americans, and Asians, began to express itself in racism towards different groups of Europeans. Literature popularizing racial views that champion the so-called Aryans versus inferiors such as Jews, Roma people, Slavic people, and so on were disseminated throughout this period. For example, the book Foundations of the 19th Century by the British writer Houston Chamberlain, held that civilization itself was a product alone of the so-called Aryan race. This message was a big hit with Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm, who championed it. Another significant influence on Germany's racial views came out of Germany's colonial holdings in Africa, especially Southwest Africa, something that I want to get into a little bit later in this presentation. Germany's colonization of Southwest Africa was particularly brutal, even among the brutality that was generally the fare among colonizing countries. Germany stood out in this particular one in their murder and enslavement of the Nama and the Herero people of Southwest Africa. Southwest Africa today is the country of Namibia. The first years of the 1900s, as nationalism and nationalist rivalries intensified, militaries of all the European colonial powers grew dramatically. Meanwhile, most people lived their lives only partially aware of these larger forces at work. There were European socialist organizations that raised the alarm and called for opposition to what they saw as a coming war. But when war erupted in July 1914, as a result of these rivalries, all these socialist groups, with the exception of the Bolsheviks in Russia, lined up behind their own governments and urged people to fight for their respective fatherlands. Germany had planned for and expected a short war, and this did not happen. Instead, a prolonged slaughter, as you probably all know, unfolded. German Jews lined up to fight for the German nation to the same degree as others did. When the German military, short on manpower, raised the military age to 60 in 1915, Benno, at age 45, became an army guard and a munitions depot at a place outside Munich called Dachau. My grandmother's, Anna's sisters, their husbands, Louis and Willie, both in their 40s, were sent to an artillery unit on the Western Front. Germany, unable to match the resources of its rivals and the entry of the U.S. on the side of the Entente, and despite the revolution in Russia in 1917, was defeated. So Germany was defeated in 1908. With Germany's defeat came a wave of anger and revulsion at the enormous suffering the war brought. Sailors in the North Sea mutinied, and along with local factory workers, began marching inland with red flags of revolution to German cities. Sebastian Haffner, who wrote one of the most important books on this era, said, "Wherever the rebels marched, the old order cracked like rotten wood." To save itself, the German military turned over power to the Social Democrats. Another story that no time to really go into. Meanwhile, the revolutionary upsurge swept into Munich. There were two mass marches on November 9, 1918. One of them, led by a rebellious anti-war activist and writer by the name of Kurt Eisner, a Jew by birth, passed by an army barracks. The soldiers thrust red flags out their windows to express their support for the rebellion. Munich's monarchy, hearing that the soldiers were joining the rebels, fled the country. It never came back. Benno, who returned from army duty shortly after the new government under Eisner came to power, saw a city in a state of great excitement with posters and new flags, lively conversations, and debates in the streets over recent events. Benno was not a fan of the new government. He was a small land investor who'd put a lot of his money in German war bonds, which were now worthless. He hoped for a return to stability and pre-war prosperity, but this was not going to be. Right-wing groups influenced by German military leaders began to spread the big lie that Germany had not been defeated in the war, but that the military had been undermined by its internal enemies. especially the Jews. Eisner and those around him, some of whom were Jewish, became a special target of their hatred. Chief among those spreading this stab-in-the-back invention was the Army's leader, Erich Ludendorff. And you can see Ludendorff with Hindenburg and Kaiser Wilhelm on the left there, or on the right? Left, that's right. Okay. And the other shot there is with Ludendorff with Hitler, but in 1923, in the attempted putsch that took place that year. Okay. This lie would become this lie of the stab in the back would become a central dogma of Nazi politics. And some people more recently have sort of likened the big lie about the stab in the back with the lie about the stolen election in 2020. They have certain similarities and they serve similar purposes. In January 1919, a young man who aspired to be a member of a fascist group called the Thule Society assassinated Eisner. And that's Eisner right there. An ominous wind began to blow in Munich. Certainly, Benno and Anna and the Jewish community would have felt that. And I want to read something here about that issue. It's a conversation, part of a conversation that takes place at the synagogue in Munich, where people gathered in the wake of these very dramatic events, sort of to be together and talk to each other about what's going on. Rage and revulsion occupied Munich in the days following the murder. Marches, gatherings, and flyers called for a second revolution. In a spasm of violence, Erhard Auer, the leader of the conservative SPD majority, a minister interior in Eisner's government, and a political rival of Eisner's, was shot and wounded by an Eisner follower. Okay. Like so many others in Munich and in the surrounding region, Benno and Anna were shaken by Eisner's murder and the events that accompanied it. They made a point of going to the synagogue the day after the assassination, feeling a need to be with their community. Benno and Anna greeted friends and joined one of the clusters of people engaged in discussion. I was not a supporter of Eisner, said Herr Klein, a young lawyer and a relatively new member of the congregation, but I give him credit for trying to bring people with different views and programs together. It's the crowd he surrounded himself with that's the problem, offered a cantor who pulled a prayer shawl around him to fight the morning chill. There are people among them who would have us go the direction of Russia. Herr Klein replied, "We don't even know what's going on there. People are just using Russia, and what they claim is happening there is a scare tactic." What was he to do? Asked Herr Neumann, an active member of the congregation and a business acquaintance of Benno's. Eisner took a stand against the war and went to jail for it. It took courage to do that. Now he's been murdered for it. He was moving towards a council government with the revolutionaries. It's too extreme, the cantor replied. The people rejected that road in the election. The people want a normal republic. Let me tell you something, an older man with a dark suit coat pulled a paper out of his inside pocket. The people who went after Eisner are not our friends, regardless of what we think about him or whether he'd been successful or not. I got this flyer on the street yesterday. He unfolded the paper slowly, his hands shaking as he began to read. Eisner, the Bolshevik Jew, got what he deserved. He and the cowardly Jewish filth he is part of had better beware. We know how they betrayed us in the war and sold us out to our enemies, and we will never forget that. We will never let the Jews rule us. It was as if an icy wind had passed over them. Then came an angry voice. Betrayed in the war? What a filthy lie. Who signed that? Some group calling itself the Union of Patriots. So this was in the aftermath of World War I and the revolution that emerged, a right-wing wind began to blow very strongly. Again, it was orchestrated in many ways by the military that was trying to push the anger of the people away from themselves towards social democrats, Jews, communists, whatever, but particularly Jews. On May 1st, 1919, 30,000 counter-revolutionary troops called Freikorps marched into Munich, massacring thousands of those who had been part of or supported the rebellion. Munich increasingly became the center of German reactionary politics. It was here and under these circumstances that Adolf Hitler led the formation of the National Socialist Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party. Tumultuous years followed World War I, with a period of wild inflation, an attempted coup in Munich in 1923, all this playing out, as it were, on the streets and beer halls of Munich. It would have been impossible for the family not to have been deeply impacted by these events. I grew up with the stories from my father living as a near neighbor to a dog walker he, Fritz, and his sister Honey frequently saw on their way to school. One morning, 11-year-old Honey, that's my aunt, was walking to school with her brother Fritz, then 12. They were on Tierstrasse, several blocks from the family's Lieberstrasse apartment, when a dog walker wearing a trench coat passed them. Fritz turned to his sister. "You know who that is?" Honey looked back at the man as he moved away from them. "No, I've seen him before, but I don't know him." Honey looked at Fritz with an indifferent expression. "Why should I? His name is Hitler, and there are posters of him around announcing his speeches at the beer halls. People come and hear his speeches, and he has a newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter." "So?" "Well, he's a Jew hater." "How do you know that, Fritz?" "They talk about him at school." "Well, what do they say about him?" "Some of the older students like him, some teachers too. Well, they like the Kaiser, and they want to go back to the old German Reich before this new government. They hate this German Republic. They say it's selling out Germany. That's what I hear a lot of them say." He stopped to kick a stone. "Anyway, they like this Hitler guy because he's saying the same things. Some of them wear his group's emblem." Honey remained silent. "You know what I mean, right?" Fritz looked at his sister. Honey shook her head. "No. It's a kind of cross." Fritz stopped walking, took a piece of paper and a pencil from his shoulder bag he was carrying, and sketched out a swastika. "Okay, I've seen that. What is it?" "It's called a swastika. People at my school who wear it hate Jews." Honey's eyes widened. "Do they hate you?" "No," Fritz answered emphatically. "I'm a student at the school. I get along with everyone." "But you're a Jew." "Okay, but they don't hate me. They hate the Jews." "I don't get that." Fritz shrugged. "I don't either exactly." "Does it bother you?" "Of course it bothers me," Fritz replied sternly. "But I can't do anything, and it's just talk." So that's a little bit of the flavor from what people were beginning to encounter in Munich and all over Germany, but particularly in Munich because that's where the Nazi Party was strongest. And because of the revolution and the counter-revolution that took place in 1918, Munich became the center of German reaction in Germany, and fascist reaction in Germany. And that had not always been that way. Before the First World War, Munich was not a particularly reactionary place, but it became that way. In the years after Hitler's ascended to power as the chancellor, okay, wait a second here. Okay. A year or two later, the March of the Armpuches, and that's what this picture is right here, the morning after the famous beer hall push, passed within a few feet of the door of the Neuburger family apartment on Lieberstrasse. Okay. In the years after Hitler ascended to power as the chancellor, appointed by German President Hindenburg, life for Jews in Germany changed dramatically. Munich, as the birthplace of the Nazi Party, was named the capital of the movement, as Jews came under especially cruel conditions there. Okay, so World War II began in September 1939 with the Nazi invasion of Poland, and as Germany prepared for the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, anti-Semitic propaganda, I'm jumping ahead here, obviously, anti-Semitic propaganda intensified. And here I'm going to read from a conversation in December 1940 between Benno and his friend Bertolt, reflecting on this intensified oppression and its connection to the history that I mentioned earlier. It's 1940, and a new movie has appeared in Munich theaters. Okay. Early December 1940. "What's going on with you today, Benno?" Bertolt asked when he opened the door and saw the irate expression on Benno's face. "I was about to tear down one of those filthy movie posters of Der ewige Jude, the eternal Jew." Benno clenched his teeth. "You see them all over now." "That dreck. I don't blame you, but Benno, that would be dangerous." "What is this Goebbels' obsession with this phrase, eternal Jew?" Benno sat down heavily in Bertolt's kitchen chair. "What is an eternal Jew?" "Satan, of course, the source of all evil. Jews, that is, you and I," Benno pointed to himself. Benno shook his head. "Now Goebbels gloats that people flock to that twisted farce of a movie." "Another lie?" Bertolt poured a glass of beer and handed it to Benno. "There were very few people in the theater where it's being shown." "What do you mean, in the theater?" "I went to see it." "What?" Bertolt sat down across from Benno. "I was curious." "Bertolt, you're talking to me about danger?" "It wasn't so much. I went in after the movie started. It was dark, and I left before it was over. And there were very few people in the theater anyway." Bertolt put up his hand. "Don't go at me about this. Hilda's already had a run at me. She said, 'We're trying to get out of this country, and you put it all at risk for what?' I could hear Anna saying that too, and I'd have to agree." "Okay, Benno. But I thought of something while watching it." Bertolt looked intently at his friend. "Do you remember those postcards of Africans years ago?" "No, I don't think so." 30 years ago, more than that now, when Germany had a colony in the south part of Africa, southwest Africa. You don't remember? They sold these picture postcards of emaciated, crazed-looking people from Africa, here in Munich at some of the kiosks and other places. Bertolt stood up and started pacing, his hands in his pockets. "I recall something like that. And your point?" asked Benno. "The people on those cards had been starved and horribly treated by German colonists." The cards didn't say that. The point was to show the public how wretched Africans were, to make people feel not sympathy but revulsion, so people wouldn't care what happened to them. But it was us Germans who caused the misery you saw in those people. I remember reading articles in Vorwärts, one of the other social democratic papers about it. Bertolt started to speak more quickly. "Well, the scenes in this Goebbels movie were shot in Warsaw, scenes of Polish Jews, people who are, many of them, in a very wretched condition. The film is saying, 'Here we show you the Jews as they really are.' Well, read between the lines. This is what is happening to Jews in Poland. Terrible things are being done to them. But the movie says nothing about that. So what happened to Africans is happening to us? Is that your point?" Bertolt, still standing, turned toward Benno. "Yes, something like that. Only it's worse for us, the eternal Jews." Benno looked up at his friend. "You're quite excited all of a sudden, I see." Bertolt ignored his remark and kept pacing. "You remember when the Freikorps came in 1918 or 19? Benno raised his hands in a questioning gesture. "Yes, of course." "Well, I remember how talk really got going then about racial pollution. Some of those Freikorps were veterans of the wars in Africa, and they became hardened haters of what they call the inferior races. And here in Munich, they were making the point that Jews were the racial polluters of Germany." "That's Mein Kampf, Bertolt." "I know. I am just making this connection. Where do you think Hitler picked up his shit? It came from the racist ideas about Africans, brought here by people like von Epps, who was a veteran of the war in the German colony, and Van Epps was one of the main Freikorps leaders. This racial stuff started before that, Berthold. There was a Kaiser's friend, I don't recall his name right now, a British writer, Chamberlain, I think. He was pushing that Aryan crap before the Germans stumbled in Africa. I didn't say it all started in the colonies. Berthold sat down suddenly. I'm just saying that some of it came from there. Okay, I get your point, Benno said. Both went quiet for a time, and Berthold spoke up. Maybe we should change the subject to something less depressing. I have something. Hilda made some apple strudel, and there's a little left. Share it? Of course. What a treat. Benno clapped his hands. It was 10 months later after this conversation, 3 months after German invasion of the Soviet Union, which began on June 22, 1941, that Benno began posting anonymous cards and denouncing Hitler as a murderer and later warning of a genocide unfolding. The first card came on the first day Jews were required to wear the yellow Star of David patch on their clothing when in public. So with that, I hope that gives a little bit of a sense of sort of what was going on in Munich at the time and sort of what led up to what became the Nazi period and ultimately the Holocaust. But there's obviously a whole lot more that could be said and asked if you want to. And anyway, so I'm gonna stop there, and I think Barry might be asking me some questions. And
Yeah, thanks, Bruce, for that really, really in-depth presentation. Very informative. I did have some questions and then I want to ask a few questions, and then we're going to open it up for everybody to participate in the discussion. You covered my papers.
Oh, I covered up.
Well, actually, the first question I was going to ask had to do with, I wondered if I know it's an important theme in your book, that the imperialist roots of the Nazis and what they represented, which you actually said a lot about already. I don't know if you want to add more or if I should go on to my second question. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that, and I think it's important to say this because, I've read a lot of Holocaust literature, and a lot of it, focuses on very important and essential things about what happened to Jews but there's a lot. I think there's a lot missing in terms of understanding where Nazism came from. I think a lot of people think that it was Adolf Hitler, this demoniacal, personality, psychotic personality, or whatever, that brought Nazism into being and so on. Actually, it's interesting that there was a picture up there of Eisner's funeral, where 100,000 people came after Eisner was murdered, even though there were a lot of he didn't have a lot of strong support, especially among middle-class Germans, but a lot of people respected him because he came in the wake of the war and he was trying to bring about something different. Anyway. But one of those people, this is what some historians claim, that one of the people that was marching in that funeral with a red armband or some kind of an armband was Adolf Hitler. Okay, and now people go, what? What's going on? What sort of happens here is that there's a certain, after World War I, there was this wave of revulsion against the military and against the war. People had suffered enormously in this war. Lost their children, their husbands, suffered, there was starvation and all these sort of things. But then there was a counter-revolution and a counterattack against all of that. And the right wing began to gain strength. And I think it's not so difficult to understand, it's not completely out of the question, that Hitler himself was won over by this counter-revolutionary wave. And he was also a very strong nationalist, German nationalist. And they played on German nationalism and racism. And of course, the attacks on Jews and so on. So, but I think it's, this would not have happened. The rise of the Nazis would not have happened had there not been this inter-imperialist conflict. It's very clear. And I think it's really important to understand that. And I wrote an article on Counterpunch where I talk about how hate became racial, how traditional, if you want to put it that way, anti-Jewish sentiments and actions were not particularly racially oriented until this period, pre-Nazi and the Nazi period. And this racialization of hatred, if you want to put it that way, came out of the experience of colonialism. Racism was such an essential element of colonialist policies around the world. I just read a book by a book called Legacy of Violence about the British Empire, and I highly recommend it. But Carolyn Elkin, who wrote the book, makes this point over and over again of just how deeply racist and how that racism, made its way back into Europe, and in its own way, sort of transformed into a different kind of racism, which resulted in what I was describing about the Aryan versus the non-Aryan and all that sort of thing. So anyway, I just think that understanding colonialism and as the sort of the basis for a lot of these kinds of ideas, it's really important.
I know another point, which is sort of the mirror image of that, is that Zionism is also a product of imperialism. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I do want to comment on that. That was not part of the book, and of course, but there's a book called by Jonathan Schneer about the what is it, the proclamation of
the Elders of Zion.
No. I'm trying to. In 1917, the British, who was then I think he was the Foreign Secretary.
The Balfour.
Sorry. The Balfour Declaration. Anyway, the British in 1917 came out with a statement in which they backed the creation of a Jewish homeland. Okay, and this wasn't just an interest in helping Jews who were suffering persecution in Europe. It came out of the war itself. In 1917, Germany was at war with the Ottoman Empire. And the British were looking for allies in the Middle East. They made some alliances with some Arab folks, but they also saw Zionism, and Chaim Weizmann, who happened to be living in England at that time, and a number of others around him, were lobbying and bringing out to the British, this would be a great advantage to your empire. And they were very much in line with, politically and ideologically, with the British Empire. They looked at the world. These were Europeans, Jewish Europeans, who looked at the world in a very similar way, that from the European, Eurocentric point of view. And so this is the origin of Zionism. It's very much, rooted in colonialism and the whole, struggle, the whole oppression of European colonists around the world. So Zionism is very much part of that, and I think that's really important to understand too. So here's the irony that both Nazism and Zionism are sort of born in the same historical period, out of the same conflict between these colonizing countries, fighting over which ones are going to be the dominant ones. And so I think that's...
Okay, good. Good. I'll ask one more, then we'll open it up. And this, I mean, you dedicate, the conclusion of your dedication is never again for anyone. And I mean, I think this is so important right now. It's such a concentration of the political battle going on around Palestine. And I just wondered, you know, why you wanted to dedicate the book that way. I mean, you've started this book like decades ago, long before the current conjuncture here around Palestine. And I just wondered, you know, how you're thinking, if you want to expand
Sure.
on your thinking on that. So.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, everybody knows, or not everybody knows, but anyway, I think probably mostly everyone here has heard the expression "never again," right? And "never again," you know, emerged in the aftermath of the Holocaust as a very genuine conviction that this kind of thing should never happen again. I don't think it was really defined necessarily at that point, but it was just this: no, we can never let this happen again. Okay. In the meantime, and over the decades, I think there's been two basic interpretations of that slogan. One is "never again" to us. Never happen again to us. No matter what we have to do, we're not going to let it happen to us again. The other interpretation, that I certainly agree with and uphold, is "never again to anyone," right? And it's a very sharp division right now, you know, in society, and I think especially in the Jewish community, about which slogan, you know, you most adhere to, or you uphold, or advocate for. And I know I was just reading, actually, just a little while ago, Meir Kahane, who was a militant nationalist Jewish Zionist personality. He actually wrote something about, he wrote, and I haven't read in depth what he wrote, but he was using the expression "never again," the slogan "never again." And I think if you look at the Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, and so on, other groups like that, Jews who are you know, opposing what's going on in Gaza and opposing Zionism, you will find all of those folks are upholding the slogan "never again to anyone." It's the only slogan that makes sense to me in terms of humanity, you know, and the future of humanity. You know, if we only rally around our whatever we define as our group, whether it's our religion or our nationality or our race or however you define it, if that's what we're going to concentrate on, if that's what we're going to fight for, humanity is not going to survive. I mean, just on a very practical level. You know, we have to break beyond that. We have to break beyond this kind of narrow thinking. And I think what's going on in Gaza and what's going on in Israel and what's going on with Zionism, you know, and one of the reasons I think it's so, you know, has touched people so deeply, and the youth so deeply, is because they recognize that there's a lot at stake here. It's not just what's happening to Palestinians. Really, it's what's happening to the world and what kind of a future we're going to have. So I do think that slogan does concentrate a lot of important things, and the struggle over those two different slogans and what they represent, I think, is really, really important for us to be conscious about.
So we can open it up for any comments or questions. So please speak into the mic. We're recording this so that it can be heard on the recording. Wait till Reiko gives you the mic.
You have to point to who. Or
Oh.
Bruce, who are
Five
you
people.
calling on? There's a lot of people with
Oh, okay, right there, start right there.
Thank you, Bruce, for your excellent presentation. I want to say that Bruce is not just an intellectual and a professor. He's also a militant and a great friend and a very nice human being. Before then I'm going to my comment and a small question. Before the crisis that came after 1918, at the end of the First World War, Lenin reminds us that the first inter-imperialist war was the Spanish-American War, with the emerging American Empire and the decaying Spanish Empire. And there is a couple of things that I want to say to take into consideration. After World War I, the first fascist government in the world was Fascist Italy in 1925. Actually, Hitler, in Mein Kampf, he at the end, in the last paragraph, says, I cannot hide my admiration from the man from south of the Alps who unified Italy and, established a fascist government. Hitler did admire Mussolini and, hoped to aspire to that. Then right after the Nazis come to power in 1933, there is before that, there is a world economic crisis, 1929,
That's true.
the worldwide financial crisis. And then there came what a lot of historians call the essay in prelude to the Second World War, which was the Spanish Civil War, where the fascistic imperialist powers, they did intervene on the side of Franco and created an absolute regime that eliminated, unfortunately, all the leftist oppositions and the buildings of revolution. That being said, I just want to ask you now more like a book question. I think, it would be great to know. I know that within your family there was active resistance to the Nazis. I mean, and I want you to comment on that and how the legacy of the Second Imperialist War, because we have to remind us that the Second World War came to try to resolve the inter-imperialist questions that were not solved in the First World War. Some historians also say that the Second World War was a continuation of the First World War. So please, could you comment about the impact in your family, the participants of your family against the Nazi regime and all that? And thank you, Bruce. I'm proud to be your friend.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Well, I mean, as far as resistance is concerned, I mean, there were many ways in which people try to resist, but primarily in my family, at least. I mean, there's my mother's side of the family, and there's another story which I won't get into right now. But on my father's side of the family, which is what this story is, this book is about, the main form of resistance, if you want to put it that way, or opposition or efforts, was to get out of the country. Okay, and I think it's important to note that the United States, which was the main place that most of my family tried to get to, although some of them ended up going to South America, actually, for a time. The United States slammed its door in their faces. And this is part of the thing that I discovered more deeply as I was researching this book. And I think it's a part of the story that a lot of people in this country don't know. And that is, there is the story about the St. Louis, for example, the ship that had 900 passengers, and it was not allowed to land in the United States and had to return to Europe, and many of the people eventually were killed because of that. But there were hundreds of thousands of people that were denied visas. And in the book, there's a lot of letters that I started talking about that in this, but there were letters that my grandparents were writing to my parents. And as I was writing the book and looking at them very closely, you could see the desperation that was there. They couldn't really express it openly, but you could sense it, and you can, between the lines kind of thing. And the desperation was because they were doing everything they could to get out. They were submitting their paperwork and so on, but they could never get a visa. And there are other things that I could say about that, but there was a memo that was written by Breckinridge Long, who was Assistant Secretary of State, specifically saying to the consulates in Germany, you should do everything you can to throw every obstacle in their path, to delay, and he says this, I'm quoting here, delay, and delay and delay. And at one point, there was something like a 6-year waiting list for visas, even though the U.S. actually had legally the spaces for Germans. Germans were one of those groups of people. Germans and the English were favored nations for the U.S. for immigration, but they definitely did whatever they could to keep the. Anyway, I talk about that and I think about that because now. We're supposed to believe that the United States is doing all this stuff in Israel because of its interest in Jews, and I just say it's BS. They don't really care about Jews; they only care about the power, of the and wealth and the competition among these imperialist countries. But anyway, so and what was the other question that you had there? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I do want to say something about Benno's resistance because I think this is important. There were many people in Munich at that time and all over Germany, Jews who were desperately trying to get out and couldn't, who committed suicide, okay? And, or just, were taken to the camps and all that and didn't resist in exactly the same way that Benno did. Although there was a lot of resistance that went on that has not really been popularized, except that Wolf Gruner, who wrote a book called Resistors, which, if you're interested in that issue, he does go into a lot more particular, different kinds of resistance that was going on, individualized for the most part. But one of the reasons I think Benno did what he did, I don't think he could have done it unless he believed there were people who would welcome his message, okay? And as someone who lived in Germany his entire life, and he knew German people, he knew that there was contradictions within the Nazi, within Germany, even at the worst times on the Nazis, or people that didn't, and it comes out in the book, and a number of the people that are spoken of, people that I got to know in my research. If he didn't believe that anyone would have been influenced by his writing, I don't think he would have done it. So he had that little glimmer of hope that he could do something, and he was, and as the title of the book, says about defiance, I purposely use that word defiance because he expressed defiance in every step of the way. When he was being interrogated by the Gestapo, when he was imprisoned, when he was in front of the People's Court, and so on, he had decided, I'm going to stand up to this in this little way, but I'm going to stand up to it. So. Wait for. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Okay, so I'm very fascinated by the history of the German Empire, how much chaos there was, and how many directions that the German Empire could have gone in, that it didn't necessarily have to end with Hitler. It just had to be a crazy time. Now, so in that sense, when we get into a period of history which is very chaotic, does it necessarily turn to the good, or does it necessarily turn to the evil, or maybe that's not the way we should think of it?
Well, I think, I think the question over here, when the comment was made about World War II sort of being a continuation of World War I, what I tried to illustrate was that, and try to understand, is that capitalism, imperialism is a system that by its nature, not because of the personalities, whether they be Hitler or Trump or Biden or whatever, not because they are the people that carry out, and they're the face of these policies. But there is something much deeper in the way the system works that compels certain things to happen. So Hitler was sort of operating on that compulsion. I mean, the elite in Germany turned to Hitler and supported him because he was effective in bringing forward and rallying the German people to a new war. And I think it's true to say that Germany desired a new war because it was trying to deal with the same problem that World War I was attempting to deal with, which is that Germany was being blocked, its development, its economic and its access to cheap resources and to labor and so on, which are necessary if you're going to be a competitive power in this world and in a global economy, as it was then. So Hitler was an effective leader for them in breaking through, and one of the things that they had to break through was that they had lost World War I, and people had suffered. So they had to have someone who's, or maybe they didn't have to have a Hitler, or it could have been somebody else, but Hitler came around and said, I have a solution to this problem of how we can get the German people to fight again, okay? The Germans who had suffered so tremendously in that previous war. And he did it by whipping up this hatred of Jews and others, and by raising this question about the Aryan Superman, and we are we're the powerful people, we can beat anyone, and this sort of thing. So he was effective, and that's why he got support from the powers that be. So.
But Benno would have supported normalization of politics in Germany if it had not been directed towards the Jews. So, this hatred had been manufactured. He really was looking after his own personal sphere, and if things would have quieted down without the Jews being persecuted, maybe they just would have persecuted only the gypsies and the homophobia, and then he would have gone along with it.
I think you're probably right. Yeah, and I think that, and that's important to understand that, yeah, he was not a radical activist or any of that kind of stuff, and he was, sort of more of a mainstream, middle-class Jewish person. I think that he was very loyal German. He, like I said, he bought war bonds. I mean, my father used to tell me, he says, your grandfather bought all these war bonds and they were worthless after the war. We were destitute. And my father had to go to work when he was 15. He had to go to work, and he worked until he came here. And it helped to help support the family because of that. But yeah, I think you're probably right, that, yeah.
But I have to interject. I mean, the conclusion you have to draw, this is my opinion from Revolution Books, is this system will generate horrors one way or another, even extreme horrors. That's what you see in Germany. That's what you see looming today, and unless it's overthrown. And that is, whether or not that happens depends not on anything inevitable or destined. It depends on what people do, what choices people make, whether people decide to take the responsibility to rip power out of the hands of those who are taking things in cataclysmic directions and do something radically different with it. That's whether or not that happens is really depends on events and whether people rise to the occasion. Everybody here is part of that. That's what we confront. So
Yeah.
Did you get a sense from your parents, from your grandparents, that of how many times that they wrote these postcards?
Oh, but yeah, no, I mean, the people's, the court had 14 postcards. Now, maybe there were others written, but those were the ones that were known. He was charged with having written the 14 postcards. Yeah. And one of the reasons, just real briefly, one of the reasons that one in particular historian, Bernhard Dorner, has, he's written about Benno, and he's the three of us are writing another book about him. It's going to be in German. I'm writing it in English, and they're going to translate it. But one of the reasons that Dorner was so taken by Benno's story is because one of his postcards, he said, 5 million, the murder of 5 million, and this is long before, not huge, but it was before there was the real Holocaust machinery was in place and functioning, and yet he saw the handwriting on the wall. So this was Bernward would say that Benno's postcard proved two things. One, that you could know what was going on. A lot of Germans said we didn't have any idea this was happening, and that sort of proved them wrong. And the other that that there was resistance, and he thought that was important for people to know that there was resistance, that Jews did resist. Yeah, Anne?
I lost my voice. I have two very strange questions.
Okay.
Can you hear? What? This way. Okay. One has to do with when were Jews across Germany allowed to buy land and hold land, to own land. That was a big problem. And the other has to do with the terrible weather conditions during the 1920s when crops failed all over Europe, where Germany as a breadbasket could not make money and could not make reparations, and how the terrible farming conditions affected the ability to find a scapegoat and to have the rise of the Nazism, because Italy had already gone fascist long before Germany actually had so many participants, but predicated on when were Jewish people allowed to buy land. That was they could rent, they could lease, but when could they actually own land, or were they ever? I'm ignorant, I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, now, the last two questions I think I kind of got, but I don't know, I didn't get the first one. Did anybody get the first question? Oh, that one I got, okay. Well, that one I can answer. Yeah, Jews in the small towns could not own land, okay. When they migrated to the bigger cities, and especially after, particularly after 1870, 1871 was an important turning point for Jews, because when Germany united into a single country, the Constitution basically outlawed discrimination against anyone on the basis of their religious beliefs. Okay, now that wasn't like discrimination ended any more like than here in the United States when they have the civil rights legislation doesn't end the discrimination. Okay, but and it turns out that Max Neuburger, like my grandfather's father, had migrated out of a small town in Bavaria. He'd come to Munich, and there he became a landowner where he could not have been in the small town that he came from. Okay, so there was, plus it really didn't make that much sense to be a land investor in a small town, because the price of land didn't really go up very much. Whereas in the city like Munich, which was expanding rapidly as industrialization was catching hold and populations were increasing, it made sense to invest money in land. Okay. Now the thing about you were talking about the weather and the conditions, and I don't know anything about that. I didn't. What I do know, the only thing regarding weather and conditions and agriculture and so on, is that during the First World War, there was a tremendous famine, and the potato crop failed, and people were eating turnips, and the caloric intake and all that sort of thing was deadly. A lot of people died of starvation in Germany. The other thing, what's that?
Was it a big part of fascism coming about?
Oh, okay. Was it a big? Not that I know of. Maybe you have other information that I don't know, and it's not like I know everything about this. But I don't know. I have not run across anything about that crop failure was a contributing factor to the rise of fascism. Does anybody else maybe know that? I don't know.
Why don't we call on him?
Okay.
Could you talk more about Eisner and his story and
Eisner.
what his movement was about?
That's very interesting.
I've never heard of him. So.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Okay, so Eisner was originally from Berlin. He was Jewish. He was a journalist. He was a poet. He was an intellectual. He was also an activist. He was Germany. There was the Social Democratic Party. Social Democratic Party had originally become into being as a revolutionary party in Germany. They were very influenced by Karl Marx, for example, and so on. But over time, as certain reforms were put in place by the German government, sort of the same process that happened in other countries, England, France, United States, as Germany became more prosperous, and the working class was not quite as, exploited as previous, the Social Democratic Party sort of split into different segments, and some became fairly conservative and nationalist, okay? And, they never completely lost any of their criticism of the German system or the capitalism or whatever, but they, during the war, the Social Democratic Party split, and there was called the USP and the SPD and the USPD. The USPD was the independent Social Democrats, and they took a stronger anti-war stand. And Eisner was the leader of that group in Munich. And again, this was towards the end of the war, or latter part of the war, when the suffering of the people was really intensifying. And he helped lead a strike of munition workers at a certain point. He was thrown in prison. Germany loses the war. He comes out of prison. He's well regarded among some people, and he leads there's this huge gathering of people in Munich, okay, in 1918, November 9, 1918, and there are two marches that come out of that. One of them is the more conservative Social Democrats, and the other is Eisner's more radical Social Democrats. They go off in different directions. One sort of just goes off in a direction to dissipate the energy of the people. The other, led by Eisner, they go to the barracks where the soldiers are. And as they approach the barracks, the soldiers put red flags out the windows, and to say, "We're with you." And their slogan was they wanted to get rid of the old power, and they were successful at that. Eisner was not a Bolshevik. He was more of what we would call today a social democrat, right? He didn't really want to overthrow the whole system. But he was popular enough personality that he was, for a time, able to bring different factions on the left together, some of whom were more radical than others. But then as things started to polarize, he lost power, and then he was assassinated. But because he was Jewish, and because a number of the other leaders, people around him, were also Jewish, anyway, the right wing in Munich, in Germany in general, really focused on that and tried to make it not a revolution, not a struggle against the old order, but kind of almost like a conspiracy of Jews to take over and dominate us. I mean, that's the way they tried to characterize it, and they used Eisner as that kind of personality to win people to that. So it was I think it was the kind of thing where things were changing really quickly. From when Eisner was killed, when he was assassinated, and by the way, he was assassinated by a Jewish person, or at least a person whose mother was Jewish, who wanted to be part of a fascist party or grouping called the Thule Society, but they wouldn't accept him because his mother was Jewish. So he assassinated Eisner to prove his fascist credentials or whatever. So crazy stuff, right? But yeah, I mean, and the power of the military and the power of the old dominant bureaucracy and so on was still quite strong. And the Weimar Republic, and there's a whole nother story here, the Weimar Republic, which was led by the Social Democrats, right? The Weimar Republic never really uprooted. I mean, if you want to, it wasn't really it was an aborted revolution. There was a revolution that started in 1918, but it was aborted by the Social Democrats. Okay, and this is a really important part of the history, because the leader of the Freikorps, for example, was a Social Democrat, even though the Freikorps were really fascist elements, So it's the Weimar Republic, there was never, and if you read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, for example, Shire's book, he gets into that. He said that, it was under the Weimar Republic, they never uprooted the old military hierarchy. They were still in power, and the old the judges and all that sort of thing. So when Hitler was tried after I'm jumping around here. I'm sorry. But when Hitler was put on trial after the Beer Hall Putsch, he was treated like a celebrity in the courts, whereas leftists were persecuted. Okay, and this is under the Weimar Republic. So this is one of the weaknesses of Weimar, and one of the reasons it became so vulnerable to being overthrown. Anyway, did I answer your question?
Let me just make a little further comment on German social democracy, not with all the details that Bruce just raised, but Lenin closely studied the German Social Democratic Party. Why had the most powerful Social Democratic Party in the world, which had pledged that they would oppose the coming World War I as an imperialist war, why had they then turned, betrayed the workers, and supported the war and mobilized people to support the war? Why had they done that? He spent a lot of time trying to understand that problem and analyze it. And I mean, people should read what he had to say about it. But just part of his conclusion was, if you had given up on revolution before the war came, then you were going to go with your own ruling class when the war hit. And that happened over and over again throughout Europe, and it happened in Germany with a vengeance. Though there were different factions and all of that, right, and more complexity, but still, that was the basic thing that did happen. That's the really crucial lesson to draw from that.
Joe?
Yeah, I was going to ask something that connects with what you just said, go a little further, because you talk about the aborted revolution in 1918. I mean, with the Spartacists and Rosa Luxemburg, who was herself a Polish Jew,
Right.
who became a major leader of the Social Democratic Party, and supposedly the most popular teacher in the party school. And teacher jokes, right? We're former colleagues at City College. But what's the connection there? Was the defeat of the Spartacists and her being Jewish, did that contribute to this whole flow that you're talking about? I just wondered how that fit in, if you think it does.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, there was a whole thing within the Nazi Party and within the right wing in general in Germany, the more fascist right wing, to try to claim that social revolution was sort of a Jewish enterprise, you know. And they could point to Rosa Luxemburg as one of the people, and Eisner and others beside them. You know? And and exactly, yeah. And of course, and then going into World War II, the Nazis made the connection between Jews and Bolsheviks a very central part of their message to arouse the German people to fight the Soviet Union against the Soviet Union. So yeah, that was a very, very key part of it. Yeah.
You call on somebody?
So you were talking about after Hitler came to power, all these people were desperate to leave.
Yeah.
And the door was slammed in their face, at least by the U.S. Why did they put so much energy into trying to leave instead of trying to organize to do something collectively? Why do you think? I mean, the Germans, after World War I, for example, it seemed like everybody and their sister had an organization. So, can you try to, give us a feel for why there wasn't some sort of united, well, not like huge even, but, why there weren't more organized groups that resisted other than the White Rose or whatever, Yeah.
No, thank you for mentioning the White Rose, but I think it's the way in which things unfolded. When Hitler took power, when Hitler became the chancellor in 1933, there was a clause in the Weimar Constitution that allowed for what we maybe would call a martial law, okay? And it meant that the central government or the executive branch of the government would be able to take into itself greater powers, right? And there was the there was the Reichstag fire that took place very soon after Hitler. I think it was in March. Hitler came, January 30th, Hitler becomes the chancellor. In March, the Reichstag fire, and they declare, this kind of martial law. I forget exactly the term they use, and very quickly, and the thing is, the Nazis had this paramilitary outfit called the SA, the stormtroopers and stuff well, not stormtroopers, the SA, which actually had grown exponentially during the course of the elections from 1930, 1931, 32. And so they used their military power and Hitler's authority as the executive in the situation of this quote unquote emergency to begin to arrest leaders of the unions, leaders of socialist groups, communist groups, and so on, and open up these concentration camps and so on very quickly. So they were able to decapitate, the leadership of these groups. Now, as far as Jews organizing, Jews were not organized in a way, in that kind of a way. They were a religion. They were not a military, There were many Jews that would have been part of socialist groups, communist groups, social democratic groups, and so on. But, the Nazis went about it very quickly to decapitate them and make it very difficult for them to organize. So the ordinary Jew, like my Jewish people, like my grandparents, they were not organizers. They didn't have an organization like that. And so I think the first impulse for a lot of those folks was just to try to get out or to try to avoid being persecuted or things like that. So, I think that's the reason, right? That
we have a book called Defying Hitler by Sebastian Haffner. You mentioned Haffner.
Yeah,
He's a very important historian. He wrote this book when he was a young man and had left Nazi Germany. And at one point in the book, he says, I was so mad. Every single party in Germany, and he included the communists, failed to understand what Hitler did. represented, failed to do anything serious to stop him. The strategic approach of the German Communist Party towards Hitler was after Hitler us. They thought, oh, he'll just fuck things up and they'll put us in they put them in the concentration camps, like Bruce just said. That's what actually happened. They completely failed to understand what fascism was and the seriousness of it. And so, I mean, that's an important part of the answer. There's more to say, but that's an important part of the answer to your question.
If I could just briefly follow up. So I get what you're saying. The whole thing of like, these are the natural leaders. But I guess, was it really, again, to focus on the White Rose, was it just really Sophie Scholl and nobody else came up with like, man, I'm not used to this shit, but like we have to do, do you have any feel for that? Yes, I get what you're saying, and I really appreciate the point that you made, but it's like, you're in the middle of all this stuff, and it's like, I mean, did people just felt overwhelmed? They just felt there's no way they could do anything because the Nazis just seemed so invincible by a certain point. I'm trying to really understand because it has parallels for today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think somebody mentioned about 1929 and the crash in Wall Street and so on, and the German economy was crippled by it because Germany at that point, because of it had come out of World War I weakened, and then they had the Versailles Treaty, and they were paying reparations, and there were a lot of things, problems, and people were not doing well, and so Hitler was able to turn that around to some degree by spending, developing towards war, spending, getting the factories and moving, and I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I do know that to some degree the U.S. and other powers aided Hitler, aided Germany. There was a thing going on too that I think is really important to understand, and that is the real enemy, as far as the British, the French, and so on were concerned, was the Soviet Union. It was a socialist country that represented an existential threat to capitalism. They were more inclined to support Germany than they would have been to support the Soviet Union. And so, for example, when the whole issue came down with the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, I write about that in the book because my grandparents were living in an apartment 5 minutes walk to Hitler's apartment, and that's where a lot of the negotiations with Chamberlain and with the Laudière were taking place, Neville Chamberlain and so on, where they had a conference in Munich, right, and to divide up Czechoslovakia. Only the Czechs were not invited, interestingly enough. So they gave in to Hitler, and nowadays we get this thing about the appeasement. Oh, it was just there. They were peaceniks. If they hadn't been peaceniks, and that's just nonsense.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but there was this song, I think it was by Tom Lehrer, but somebody like that, like in the 60s, good job, well done, Neville Chamberlain.
Yeah.
You really showed that bloody Hitler chap. And so, I can see, and the point you made about how the economy maybe was improving, so it wasn't, there were people who were really being demonized, but there were also people who were like, hey, we're doing great.
Well, and nationalism, just like here, I mean, with the Trump and all that crap. I mean, nationalism was a potent force in Germany, and Hitler when they were successful in taking over Austria and then the Sudetenland, it made the nationalist-minded German feel like, oh yeah, we're on the move, that kind of thing, and put the people that may not have been in that category on the defensive. But I mean, the point is that the Western powers, so-called Western powers, actually aided Hitler because as long as he was moving east, as long as he was, moving in the direction of the Soviet Union, in other words, they could see supporting him, and ultimately, I mean, I think it was Mao Zedong talked about World War II as like the sitting on the mountain watching the tigers fight. I mean, they were, they wanted to see Germany and the Soviet Union smash each other to pieces. That was sort of the strategy. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here, but I think there's another question.
There was a hand in the back, actually, of someone who hasn't spoken.
Did I answer your question? Did I answer your question?
I was thinking when
Did I
I
answer your question?
when I read the book, I'm halfway through, so I was so grateful there's no parallels to today. No, that was a joke. I mean, it's really striking when you're reading it, and I love the way you wrote it because you put all these conversations that they're having at the beer hall, and then they're talking to each other about what's unfolding in the world around them, and how they so felt themselves as part of Germany. It's just a lot of history in there about what they were contributing, even the development of German society, like was the influx of the Jewish migration from Poland and Russia had a lot to do with spurring the economy, I think. And anyways, but the main thing is that these parallels to today, because somebody earlier asked why wasn't there more resistance? I mean, look around you, there's really, fascism is intensifying, the whole MAGA fascists of Trump and all that, and they have a determination. If they don't win the election's illegitimate. They're setting things up for an armed clash between the fascist section and the war criminal Democrats or the genocide Joe. And the need to wrench look at the whole scapegoating of immigrants at the border. They're putting concertina wire in the Rio Grande, and now Biden says he's going to freeze immigration for migration of people coming in if there's so many asylum claims in a certain period. The point is like this whole. When I read your book, I'm thinking about the fascists that were chained up in the basement, which are now fully off the chain and out in society. It's like all the exit doors are closing in the theater, and what people do is like really, really, really critical. And the imperialist war contention between U.S. and, I'm sorry, it's Putin's war, I forgot. No, U.S. imperialism and Russia over Ukraine, or U.S. and China over Taiwan. They're fighting over the redivision of the world, and these are pre-World War III events, and there's nothing that's going to hold them back except millions of people overthrowing them in countries around the world. And I just wanted to say to the people here tonight, the RevCom's Corps for the Emancipation of Humanity has a project going on this summer, a revolutionary summer to prepare to make revolution. If this crisis opens up and there's a possibility, this is a rare time when it is more possible, but we have to prepare. And this summer, especially the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August is going to be very important, because there's a whole generation of students that are losing their allegiance to the system over Palestine and what U.S. imperialism is doing and backing Israel to the hilt. So people need to come out to the protests in Chicago in August, and we're fighting to raise $50,000 to fund this whole project, so people can feel free to contribute tonight. That would be very important. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I just wanted to say one thing about the students in Germany. It was a situation that the students lined up behind the nationalists. They did. They lined up behind the nationalists. I mean, and some of the conversations. I mean, this is not comes out of my reading about that era. There was not an anti-fascist German mass movement of students. The students were very influenced by these racist ideas these Aryan, we're Germany. Unfortunately, that was one of the things that made it difficult. Objective thing that made it difficult. Whereas in this country, because of the history of struggle here, civil rights movement and all that, struggle against the war in Vietnam, and now Gaza, we have a burgeoning student movement, which is extremely important. And so I just wanted to say that. The other thing is that what you were talking about, imperialism leads to division and war. You saw that in World War I, and in some ways we're seeing the repeat on a different level in a different period, obviously, with different countries. But you see the same basic phenomenon, that countries going at it. I mean, why are they even talking about war with China? Why are we having a war in Ukraine? What is this all about? It's just insane. But it seems totally insane unless you understand the way the system works and how the system, of competition between capitalist blocks and countries and so on is an essential part of the way the system works, and people get frustrated because, well, can't they realize this is not good for us? Well, Biden and the rest, they're operating in the interest of the system, and they, in a certain sense, don't have a choice. If they want to continue to keep the system functioning, there are certain things that they have to do. And I think it's important for us to realize that. This is not an option for them. And it shouldn't be an option for us whether we're going to take up a struggle against the system. Because if we want to end this kind of insanity, war with China, give me a break. We're going to have to get rid of the system that causes it. I mean, it's just, and, I think there were a lot of illusions in Germany. People were swept up in nationalism and all this sort of thing, and it made it very difficult for people to stand up to Hitler as they should have. But I think we have to learn from that. And,
one of the things that I liked about your book, I'm interrupting, I know.
No, it's okay.
Is that all these big things are happening, and the characters in the book, they really are characters, right? The different families are trying to figure out what all these things mean and how to respond to them, right? And one law after another, or one regulation after another, comes down, and they're like, why is this happening? What do we do? But I have to say, I don't really think leaving Germany was a form of resistance. That's my personal feeling. And I feel the same way when I hear, some of the statements of celebrities and stuff who say they're going to leave if Trump is elected. But it did seem, and you get this from the book, is that, because of sort of standing with empire and feeling that they were Germans and kind of wanting to go along and live their little lives and accrue, have their families and have some money and stuff like that, that the impetus to actually resist and condemn and join with others with these huge injustices that are going on came too late. And I think, that was part of, with the, the communists being smashed fairly early, right? But, so that's part of what I felt is the value of the book, is it shows sort of across all these really big things happening, it shows if you don't look at the big stuff, you're fucked. You're fucked. You're lost. And it's. I think you unfolded in a very moving way. Is you began to feel for this family and their dilemma there, and the fact that there was no real leadership, right? Saying, how do we fucking get out of this mess, right? So they were trapped and they were caught until it was too late, and they were trying to get the people out that they could, But that, I felt in your book, that's not that's not the only way. That's not the way it had to be, and that's not the way it should be now. And I read it very much thinking about all of the things that are happening now, you know, so, and I second what Joey was saying about the RevCom Corps is calling for Revolution Summer, because I think that's what we need, and people should join it on whatever level that they can, you know, contribute to it.
I just want to add one point. The lesson you have to draw from Nazi Germany, I think, is at a certain point it becomes too late, or it becomes extremely difficult to resist in any meaningful way. Once a fascist force like the Nazi Party consolidates power, it took 20 million Soviet citizens dying to crack them, basically, and that's the only thing that did crack them, was that war, and that's what's posed to us right now. We don't have forever, because things are moving very fast, and we need to break free. And the students this spring pointed in a really important way, but it's much more is needed. That's the point of Revolution Summer. So I would just underscore that.
Okay, Kurt over there.
Barry was making the connection between imperialism and Zionism. And I have been coming across numerous articles talking about what's happening in Gaza as imperialist intentions behind it. And apparently last year, Israel started exporting their own oil. Up till now, they've had to import oil. And then looking further into it, there's a huge reservoir of oil under the water,
off the coast of Gaza?
On the coast of Gaza, too. And then connecting that with this weird floating pier thing, and making the point that that can easily be switched into, getting your boots on the ground, to establishing yourself on the ground. And I think it was a new idea to me, because this idea of it being imperialist, and I think it really, bears further study and consideration. It explains, them closing off the border with Egypt, because Egypt is the main distributor of oil of that immediate region. And then there's a long-term connection between the oil and the further Middle East. If you draw a line between, from Iraq, the logical thing is to just go to Israel, as far as the shortest overland way to, rather than taking it up over the, to the north. So anyway, I just, I find that interesting. It's something new to think about.
I mean, the way I've thought about why the U.S. is so hell-bent on backing Israel, that could well be. I don't know, but what I've thought is that the growing contention we were talking about between the U.S. and Russia and China and so on, that the U.S. has relied on, or has counted on, Israel and its military and its various other parts of its its intelligence structure and all that sort of thing, to carry out actions that are in the interest of the U.S. empire. And it's been very key in doing that in many different places. So the oil part of it, I don't really know about. I've read articles about that too, but
I think you brought up the question of immigration, how, your grandfather was trying desperately to get family members out of Germany, like a lot of people elsewhere in Nazi-occupied Europe. And I think one aspect of him hitting a wall, and many people like him hitting a wall, was the fact that the United States at that time had a very, very restrictive immigration policy, particularly against Jewish people. And and like FDR, whom many people in this country worship as a saint, basically would say, okay, yeah, we'll do something for you, and then turn around and do nothing. So like, for example, Anne Frank's family tried to desperately to emigrate to this country, and they were turned around. They were not allowed to enter the country, and they were basically forced back to Europe to their deaths. And we see the same, and I think fundamentally, in many ways, the immigration policy of the system has never, ever been good for anybody on this planet. As long as you as long as you can make the system function and you're useful, you can come in. But the minute you're no longer useful, or they decide they don't want you, it's a hell on earth for people.
Well, I think there's, immigration, it's a whole another huge topic. We're talking about immigration here. Immigration is, when you talk about immigrants coming, especially from the south of the border, are a backbone of the entire economy in this country. And on the one hand, they use immigrants to create divisions among the people and as scapegoats for all that kind of stuff, rouse white supremacist madness and all that. But the reality is that without immigrants, the economy here wouldn't function. And that's pretty clear. Anyway, but I think there's a different factor involved with Jews in that period. There was a conference that took place in France, in Evian, France, in 1938, in which there were 32 countries came together to talk about the problems Jews faced in Europe. And not one of the countries at that point was willing to open up to broaden its immigration openings to Jews. So, anyway.
We should just say the U.S. at that time was drenched with anti-Semitism. Places like Harvard had open quotas. Only so many Jews could be in the student body at a given time. And down the line, that was not just Harvard, down the line. That's how this society was. That has a lot to do with why they didn't let the Jews in and didn't give a fuck about what happened to them.
Yeah, okay, over here.
Actually, while in the year 1935, while the Nuremberg laws were approved, which were segregation laws and laws of oppression against the Jewish people in Germany, right here we had Jim Crow legislation. And actually, the Nazis copied the eugenics, racist politics from the United States. And, I want to congratulate you guys for bringing the system as the system. No matter if it is a democratic imperialism, they go and propagate war and colonialism. Before World War I, or during World War I, the United States in 1915 invaded Haiti, 1916 the Dominican Republic, 1917 Veracruz in Mexico, and then 1934, right after Hitler came to power, invaded and occupied Nicaragua. And this was democratic United States. Well, democratic Britain and France had colonies in Africa, murdering people, humiliating people. So, that is the nature of the system. Lastly, It was mentioned the Communist Party of Germany pre-World War II. Actually, that party was the largest communist party in the world, but applied wrong strategies and tactics, and they were defeated of that. They called the Social Democrats social fascists, and Ernest Thälmann, like you said, he said after the Nazis will come into power, but also that was the position of the International, and the system needs this. They take advantage of our mistakes in the left if we make them. So we got to learn from them. There are people that in the United States refuse to believe that they're fascists in the U.S. and within the Republican Party. There are people in the left that refuse to believe that, unfortunately. So I want to thank you and thanks Revolution Books for this extraordinary talk. I really loved it. And, Bruce, congratulations on your books. And good luck, man.
No, thank you. Thank you.